Okay, it's 2 p.m. Let's start our session. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome to our session on sports analytics beyond the field. I will be the chair for this session. I am Mary Salvania. I am an assistant professor at the Department of Statistics here at UConn. We will have 4 speakers in this session. Each speaker will have 17 minutes for presentation, followed by 5 minutes of Q&A. If any questions arise during the presentation, please reserve them until the speaker is done. Okay, let's begin with our first speaker, Dr. Jackson Lautier from Bentley University. His talk is about a new framework to estimate return on investment for player salaries in the National Basketball Association. Let's welcome Dr. Lautier.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a nice introduction. So as alluded to, today's goal is kind of a financial exercise, but also statistical. So, we'll try to relate everything together here, but really the objective is imagine yourself, you're in the financial world, you're trying to decide between 2 asset classes to invest in. A very natural starting point is, well, let me look at the historical return between Fund A and Fund B. And when you're in the financial world, typically what's going in, the investment, is money, and what's coming out is money. So it's kind of a finance 101 calculation. I think where things get a little bit interesting is when the thing going in is monetary, like a player's contract, and the thing coming out is non-monetary, so like rebounds, points. What exactly is that worth? How well are you doing relative to others? So that's kind of the goal today. And I mentioned Finance 101. I know this is more of a stats conference. So what you're looking at here, this is a cash flow timeline. And CF0 typically is your investment in. So imagine you're buying like a rental property. That's how much you purchase the property. CF1, CF2, all the way up to CFN. Those are what the cash flows you receive. So generally speaking, kind of a starting point, how you would calculate how well this particular investment is doing is that equation at the bottom. You want the money that you're invested in to equal the discounted present value of the cash flows it's throwing off. So what you're trying to find is that rate R. So our goal is to replicate this equation using salary data and what's happening on the course. Right? So we're going to try to build here. Now, just very high level, like review what's out there. So this is a basketball analytics is a very big field. It's growing rapidly, but there's really 3 check boxes I tried to hit. Number 1, I want to operate on a per game basis. And the reason for that is I want to treat each game like a potential cash flow. That's kind of step 1. Also, I want to try to use some of the more recent player tracking data that's available. And then finally, the big one, I want to consider salary and on-court performance together. And I think this is really kind of the final frontier of where at least professional level analytics goes, because, think about it. 2 people sell a house for different amounts. Who does better? Well, you really have to know how much they paid for that house through a formal calculation. So it's a similar type of analysis here. So this slide, this is really the entire manuscript, and it's a 5-part process. So I think this is the intended novelty here, and then we'll talk about each component. And even I think a feature is you can kind of take out stuff you don't like, put stuff you do like into different spots. So the first goal is you want to select a time period. This is pretty natural. So we're pretty much going to use one NBA regular season, but it could be the last 5 years, could be the last month. That's the first thing you need to set. Next, you need to do 2 things at the same time. For each game in that time horizon, you need to okay. So you need to do 2 things for each game in that time period. Number 1, figure out a way to distribute credit for each player within each game. Okay, so this is one thing I'm going to spend some time with. And the second thing is you need to estimate a dollar value of every single game in that investment horizon. Once you have those 2 things, they kind of smash together in part 4, where you're basically giving each player a dollar share after the game based on how they perform. So a very good game, you get a big share. A very poor or even negative game might actually owe money in this theoretical metric. And then at the very end, you have your cash flows, you have your salary, you can perform your ROI calculation. So if we do this right, we will achieve this as we go forward. So part one, I'm going to focus on one NBA regular season. So now I want to talk a little bit about how to redistribute credit. So there's a couple things that are out there. One, if you've been on Basketball Reference at all, there is something called the game score. It's a bit of a, use it just box score statistics, has some hard-coded coefficients. That's fine. It's nice. It's one game. So I'm going to track this as well. There's also something that's gone through a little bit more of a peer review. This is called a win score. Similar approach. Just kind of calculate some statistics at the end. Tries to give you a score based on that game. So I'm going to propose something called the win logic to do this, but I'm also going to track these two just as a comparison point. So this idea of a win logic, it's kind of a three-step thing. Just for the sake of time, I'm sort of zooming over this at a little bit higher level. But number one, I want to fit a logistic regression. So the thing I think is important is wins. Different approach might be championships, might be maximizing revenue. I'm going to imagine wins is the goal here. So you can fit a logistic regression at the team level, but then looking at the way team statistics in basketball accumulate for each player, I'm going to try to distribute that logic to each of the players based on that. And then finally, at the end there, do this standardization where start with an average uniform share and then redistribute away from that average based on the performance in the game. I'm going to try to walk through each of these to get our credit model. So first of all, logistic regression, super high level here. Each game is a Bernoulli random variable. That probability of success, that probability of a win, through this linking function is a linear equation based on some covariates. So like rebounds, turnovers, things like that, what happens on the court. So our goal is to estimate the beta coefficient for all the games in our data set at the team level. Now, what's the case for basketball statistics, and I think most statistics, is what happens at the team level. So here's the Celtics here. The team total, for the most part, is the total of the individual players. So a couple big things here. There's some assumptions that I'm kind of loosely saying, like independence, but especially this beta 0, that intercept term. If that's 0, then what you can do is translate the team win probability to each of the individual players as their contribution. So this is how it's trying to be allocated here. So from this, so that logic, PM, that's each of the players' fitted logic based on reallocating this team contribution. The index is changing a little bit here. I focused only on players in a game, so I apologize for the formulas I'm just talking at a high level, but I want to focus on this equation at the bottom because this is how I'm distributing credit. So first of all, that logic there, equation 2 at the bottom, that's what's fitted from the model. What I'm subtracting is the average for all the players versus all the games in the data set. And then it's standardized, and then it's multiplied by 1 over m bar. What's m bar? It's the average number of players in a game. So I'm saying when the game starts, everyone gets an average share. And then if you have an above average game, you get a little bit more. If you have a below average game, you get some taken away. And if you have an exactly average game, you just get your uniform share. So this is basically the credit model. And you can do the same kind of adjustment for game score or win score. So I'm using this logic approach. You could pick your favorite metric and then try to do the same thing. This is like a wealth redistribution tool, if you want to think about it that way. So what do some results look like? This is where all the data comes from. It's all publicly available. I think the important thing for us is down at the bottom. If you want this data, if you want this code, it's free. It's out there, so you can download it. So I'm looking at the 2022-2023 NBA regular season. First thing here is just what does the distribution of these different credit models look like? The win logic, that's blue. You can see it's symmetric. You can see they all have the same mean. They all have the same standard deviation. So that 1 over m bar, so they're all standardized that way. But how they're distributed based on credit is different depending on the model. Win score, game score, a little bit more right skewed. Win logic, more symmetric. Again, same mean, same standard deviation. One thing I also think is important, just coming from a finance background a little bit, is I really want to focus on what's happening on the court. And in particular, for a missed game, I want that to be a 0. The financial interpretation would be that's like a default. So you define this equation 3, where you either get a 0 or you get your game's win logic, and then just assuming a 0 interest rate, you can just sum up over your entire season. So this is like a present value of win logics over the entire season. So what I think is nice about this is let's compare 2 players here. So at the top, this is Kevin Durant. This is his 2022-2023 NBA season. Kevin Durant had an excellent season in the 47 games he played, but due to injury, there's a lot of missed games. At the bottom, this is Tari Eason. Tari Eason had a very solid season. Tari Eason played in all 82 games. What I think is important from this slide is this PVWL, that sum total is 4.5 for each player. So this creates like a break-even analysis for how many games does a Kevin Durant need to miss to become a Tari Eason or vice versa. So this is just something I really haven't seen that I thought is important when you're trying to think of this cash flow type analysis. Additionally, just how does this metric look? So I looked at the present value win logic, so that's sum total per season for all the players in the NBA. I want to break it out by position just because of the nature of basketball. You know, this we've heard the big man bias that's kind of coming true here as well. But if you look at the 5 positions, if you look at the outliers all the way to the right, these are the names that, you know, passes the sniff test at least, seems pretty solid in that way. It's interesting to see a couple Celtics up there. So again, if you want all the results for all the players, check out GitHub. All the details are out there. The other thing that's, I think, interesting is you can compare them. So if you use a win logic and game score, win score, or your favorite, this is a percentile plot. So if they agreed completely, you would get everything down that diagonal from the top left to the bottom right. They'd all be on top of each other, nice line. Where you get the disagreements is the off diagonals. This is where the metrics disagree between certain players. So you can see that game score, win score in the top right, pretty similar generally, but then you go to win logic, pretty different in certain players. So just, I know this is a little bit more of a student-focused conference, so how might you use something like this? Just as an example, this is a trade that happened this season between the Knicks and the Raptors. So if you look at the players that each team receives, if you go all the way to the right, if you just look at the game score, present value game score column, it would appear that the Raptors probably won this trade, just based on this metric. If you look at the players they received at the bottom, those are pretty high percentiles compared to what the Knicks received. On the other hand, different player credit model, you go to the win logic all the way to the left. Here, how it feels about RJ Barrett is a lot different. How it feels about Precious Achiuwa is a lot different. All of a sudden, this looks a lot closer. And then what you would need to get out of that draft pick to kind of get the difference. So the only point of this slide, different player evaluation metrics, this is how markets are made, right? Teams feel differently about certain players, and this is how trades come together. Okay, so that's part 1, part 2. Now, assuming we have a player credit model you feel good about, we need a dollar value of each game. You could go crazy with this. The model I want to use is just that the value of a game depends on how many people saw it. So the first thing is how many people attended it, the gate, and then whether or not it was on television. So you get the television revenue, you get the advertising revenue. The simplistic model for which games are more valuable. Different approach might be standings related. You have to decide on that, but this is just, if more people see it, it's worth more. So pretty standard. So now we have a way to distribute credit, a dollar value. So we need to create the cash flows. Rather than throw a bunch of formulas at you, I'll just give you an example. So this is LeBron James. LeBron James's game values. He's on the Lakers. This is that first vector here at SGV. First game is worth $26.3 million, according to my model. Second game, $26.4 million, all the way out to the last game. What was his win logic? Apologize for all the decimals, but this WL vector, that's his share, according to my model. So 8% the first game, 9.7% the next game. Second to last game of the season, below average game, a little bit of a negative share, and then 13% big number at the end. How do you create the cash flows? Just a pairwise product. That's what this little circle dot is supposed to mean, a computer science term. So for example, that 2.2 in that bottom vector, that's 26.3 times 0.08. So now we have a vector of cash flows, right? So how do you calculate the return on investment? Our last step here, well, back to LeBron James, right? His salary is $44.4 million. That's cash flow 0. His cash flows we got in the previous step. These become the future cash flows. So you solve for that rate R such that both sides are equal. And you have estimated the return on investment for LeBron James based on last season. A couple things here. If that number feels low, LeBron missed 27 games. So there's a lot of zeros in there. That's not pictured. Also doesn't include playoff games. So you might want to make an adjustment that way. So that's it. So what does these results look like for this group overall? So The estimated gain values, these are just those alpha coefficients. These are basic estimates, just a standard kind of average here. Again, nice sniff test. What are the top 5 teams with the most value? Lakers, Warriors, Celtics. These are big market teams. And one caveat from this is if you are a player on a team with more valuable games, all else equal, you're going to generate a higher ROI. So then this is the ROI of all the players in the league for last season, just based on the win logic. So on the vertical axis, this is return on investment. On the horizontal axis, this is a log of the player's salary. No surprise, as the salary is higher, right, it's harder to generate a higher return. And I think what you can take away from this is just what are some of the players that stand out, right, versus the players that don't generate a higher return. And the one thing I would emphasize from this is there's no minimums game played. The only thing that I control for here is you need a league minimum salary. That's the only thing. So if you only want to play in 2 games, that's going to affect your ROI. One other thing you can do from this, treat the positions as asset classes, right? So this is a basic financial term, really a statistics term. It's coefficient of variation. Standard deviation divided by the mean ROI per the players in that position. The goal here is how much risk am I taking per return? So something like this, in the first column, the win logic would say point guard is where there's kind of a lot of volatility in your return versus the center position, a little bit safer. It's interesting to compare game scores, kind of flatter among the different positions. So just an example of the type of metric you could do when you're making player personnel decisions. Okay, so just kind of a wrap up slide here. So I think this is the first thing I've seen that tries to combine everything together, right? So you get this encore performance, and then how does it get this return on investment? I think in addition to like NBA teams, right, this might be interesting to them, but also the players, right? You can advocate for more, if you're being underpaid, things like that. And finally, this has all been a retrospective analysis, right? Historical return, but you could instead project what's going to happen on the court, and then do that to generate your cash flows and discount that back. And then finally, I really want to emphasize this is you can customize this however you want, right? You don't like the win logic, fine. Plug your own in there, get your own cash flows. You can do more precise salaries. You could include off-court revenue like jersey sales. You want playoff games in there, whatever. And then finally, maybe this could apply to other sports. Okay, so this is the framework again. This is the intended paper here. And then this is my information. Like I said, there's a GitHub out there, has all this code, has this data, latest version of the manuscript. I have a couple of minutes for questions. I know I kind of blew through that, but.
Here's now open for questions. Questions to Dr. Lautier?
So I have a question on, I saw Derek White's value was very high. That was interesting. And that happened from the trade from Spurs to Celtics. But I don't think Celtics was like expecting that because Derek White was good in Spurs, but like wasn't like this good, right? So like what would you like? So like you're saying that like we can like change the model to like consider for like different trades and stuff. But also like there's an interaction between like teams, right? If we want to like make a prediction like because if like the manager want to use this model for like trade planning, maybe that would be like important point. Like, do you have any insight on like how to make this like interaction that like we have never seen?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of the inherent trickiness, right? So from a financial perspective, you might try to find a distressed asset, right? And think, okay, if we bring it in here with our orchestration, turn it around, and you can go as crazy as you want with part 2 here. So really try to control for different things. Maybe what wins games for the Celtics approach versus the Spurs, and then try to translate that player. So what would this player generate within our team versus another team? So just have your own model. I think that one trade-off with this is I want to emphasize the overall thing. And the more crazy I go with part 2, it distracts from the overall. So you're absolutely right, but that's not necessarily in here. It's kind of averaged across the game.
Questions?
There's a lot of players that are contributing high ROI that are making less money.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know much more those players.
So
Can you tell us something about that? Those people who are up there
So at the tippy
giving
top,
up like 90% ROI.
yeah, these are players making like the league minimum that happen to get more playing time, so they're a little bit unusual.
Okay.
The NBA is a little bit unique in that player salaries are kind of dictated by contract length sometimes. So if you have a player very early in their career who's really outperforming, it's a big market inefficiency. It's very regulated.
Oh, I see.
So that's a little bit what's happening. Whereas all the way to the right, these are the max salary players.
Right.
Very hard to get that back, at least based on regular fees.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Do you think that's an adjustment for like the salary cap based off different teams and how it increases over the years would be like necessary if you were to try and build it out?
So that's, I guess the interesting thing there is the salary is the percentage of the cap. So it's not necessarily the salary cap number, but I do think there's penalties for how far you go over. So if, say, you're a team that's on the edge and you need a center, you might try to get Noah Vonleh, right? What you're going to get based on that salary, that might help you that way. So like, but a more complete analysis would be how much does it cost this team versus another team. I agree with you.
Questions? I have a question. What is a negative share? They have to
So
pay if they don't perform well?
the theoretical values, right? So it's not actually clawing money back, but it's more of this is what an average player based on this model would have produced. This is what you produced. It is less, therefore you have a shortfall.
Questions? No more questions, and we
Thank you.
thank Dr. Lautier. Let's go to our second speaker, Shinpei Nakamura Sakai from Yale University. Shinpei will talk about estimating the age condition average treatment effect curves and application for assessing load management strategies in the MBA. Let's give a round of applause for Shinpei.
Hi, I'm very honored to speak here, and actually, like the early version of this project was presented 2 years ago in this conference. It was a very early version. Now we have a preprint like under submission on this. So huge thanks for the organizer for all the effort. It has been great for the development of at least this project. I'm a fourth year PhD student at Yale in statistics and data science. And this work is a collaboration with Laura Frostier and Brian McDonald. So, so the objective of this presentation is to connect age curve and causal inference. And so, if you don't understand my framework, that's fine. If you can, if you can get something from age curve or causal inference, that would be enough for my presentation. I'd be very happy. So this is the age curve. It's very simple. So this is Kobe Bryant's point per game per like x-axis is his age and y-axis is performance. And when he starts like in the league, like first he started novice, but he started like getting more experience and his performance gets better. And once he gets in the peak, like he declines because he gets old, right? So this is it's very simple concept. I don't know like which is the best term. Is like we call edge curve, but I know Kwang Greg call like edging curve. So I don't really know like which is the right term. So but edge curve could be very like different. So like I was showing the Kobe Bryant one, but if we see for like different players, there's different pattern for the decline. So this is very interesting. Like edge curve, actually, like the shape of the edge curve, it will like reveal us how fast they will decline, or like whether like that depends on position, or like it's very important to understand what like drives them to drop, because like this would like give us a good information on how many years we should like extend the contract, or how much money we should pay for each of the player. And like the shape also looks different if we change from point per game to rebound per game, for example. It looks quite different. Even in the rebound consists of offensive part and defensive part. If we see that offensive part, it declines much faster, because offensive rebound is much more physical than defensive rebounds. Okay, so this is a very short intro on edge curve. And the contribution of our paper is threefold. So the first thing we did is we incorporate the game level data. So if we compare, if we see the literature on edge curve, most of the data, like the model that is like presented is like season level data. So that it could be helpful for like contract determination. But game level data like actually adds a very rich information such as like back-to-back games, or team you play for, team you compete against, and etc. There are so many confounders that like drive the performance of each of the players. And this will enable us to make the decision for each of the games instead of just the contract. So for example, if like you are the Lakers manager and LeBron James is playing against Denver like tomorrow, then maybe you could like predict what would be the treatment, what would be the performance in like that specific scenario. And in the second like contribution is that like we provide a framework to estimate the edge conditional treatment effects. So we have some treatment. In our case, is the rest, like whether the game is back-to-back or not back-to-back. We will provide a framework to estimate that treatment effect of like rest, whether that rest like actually matters or not, because there's a lot of like controversy in load management in NBA. Finally, we use this framework to assess the load management strategy in NBA. Okay, so how many of you, I mean, I know this is a very student like focus conference, so I wanted to give a very, very short introduction on causal inference. How many of you know what's the difference between correlation and causation? Okay, so yeah, I will spend a little bit time on this. So this is the shark attack on ice cream cells, right? And it's pretty correlated. So does eating ice cream cause me to be attacked by shark? Do you think that sounds like reasonable? Yeah, so maybe not, right? Maybe like eating ice cream like doesn't have anything to do with the shark. But what is really happening is that in the summer, like the temperature goes out, you go to the beach, then like you maybe receive like shark attack, or like you eat more like ice cream, right? So what it is really causing is the sun or the temperature. And these are the byproducts because the sun is shifting those two variables in the same direction, right? But you know, this is a sports conference, so I'm not going to talk about shark and ice cream. And like, you know, this could be like translated on our problem. So maybe like there's a correlation between like, you know, if one player is good on like scoring, they could be good on rebounding like itself, but the amount you score doesn't cause you more like rebound. I mean, in the game, the play-by-play game, like it might be true because if you do the offensive rebound, maybe you can score more. But if you see in the game level, maybe this is just a correlation, not the causation. And what we want to know is like whether resting 1 or 2 more days actually cause this performance like go up, right? Okay, so there's another example that I have. So let's say like we have 3 players, and the treatment is whether like you're playing back-to-back games. And this is the observed point per game. So like looking at this, like player 1 who didn't play on back-to-back game scored, oh sorry, it should have been the other way around that example. But okay, so okay, never mind. So let's say like the player 1 didn't play back-to-back and scored like 20. And okay, let's say that this is yes and this is no. Sorry. The player 1 like did play back-to-back and scored 20, and player 2 and 3 is rested and they score like 30 and 25. Is this going to be enough to determine that actually like resting is like effective? So that's one of the questions, and this could be solved by one of the potential like most renowned framework in causal inference called potential outcome framework. And potential outcome framework actually is a missing value problem. So we observe this value. Like, I mean, sorry, I missed that no one did yes, but we observe this value because like we observe the value of player 1 when they played back-to-back games, but we didn't observe the value of the player 1 when he did play the back-to-back game. So this is a missing value, right? And why this is important? This is important because if the potential outcome is something like this, actually like there's no effect. So like estimating the actual like counterfactual would actually give us the true treatment effect and not so the frequency approach would not be enough. Some like just a t-test is not enough, but looking at the potential outcome would enable us to discover more true causal thing rather than not just a correlation. So now that we are in the same page on causal inference and what is H-curve, let me explain my framework. So the framework, there's two ingredients on the framework. The first one is the conditional expectation function. Sorry for a lot of notations, but basically the takeaway is that mu zero is the expectation of the control group. So control group in this case is the players who are playing back to back, and mu one is a treatment group who are more rested. So you have two different expectations for the player on different counterfactuals. And under this framework, we can define that each conditional treatment effect as a difference of those. So it's quite simple. It looks more difficult in mathematical form because people like to impress people by using different, more complicated notations. But it's actually simple. So now that we define the estimand, how do we estimate this ACT or tau? And we use three method learning approach provided by Kunzel in 2019. And it will allow us to use any predictive model or any supervised machine learning model that it's on your head. Traditional H-curve analysis is done based on OLS, but the problem of OLS is that it's hard to capture the nonlinearity of or interaction because you have to specify the interaction rather than if you do neural nets or random forest, it can capture the nonlinearity by the intrinsic bias of the intrinsic construction of the model, right? So there is three types of learner. I'm not going over those details, but S learner is the simplest and X learner is the most complicated one. There is those algorithm. If there's question, I can go over it. But basically, this M means that you are fitting any machine learning model. It could be OLS. So if you have used any R notation, it would be this is the outcome and these are the covariates. So you can see as this is fitting a regression when M is regression. So basically what you fit one model where the treatment is the coefficient of your the treatment variable. The treatment effect is the coefficient of the treatment variable. Is a X learner. In the T learner, you fit two models. What you fit one model for control group and one model for treatment group. So you fit two regression or any machine learning model. So the one intuitive way to see intuitive pro and con is that in S learner you're fitting only one model, so you don't need a lot of data set. So because it's less complicated. But in two learner, let's say you use 100 observation here, you split up in case treatment group and control group are the same number. You now are fitting two models on 50 observations. So this will suffer more if the number of sample is smaller. And X learner is more complicated. It has to be with double machine learning thing that the biases when if you do this, and this makes more unbiased estimator. But I'm not going to over that detail. Okay, so this is the way I'm estimating the tau. And okay, so I'm saying oh, this is flexible and you can use any machine learning model. And we have three learners. So now the problem is, okay, which combination should we use? We can use OLS splines, the edging curve literature has done, combined with any of the learner. We can use OLS spline with S and TOX, or we can use more complex random forest model with any of the combinations. So at least there's 6 combinations that we can try out. And you can try neural nets, or you can try XGBoost, and then you have more combination that you could try. And to determine which combination. Do I still have 6 minutes?
6 minutes. 5 minutes per question.
Okay. Okay, so I was talking about all the possible combination, and we have to pick which would be the best for our problem. So we devised this scenario, hugely based on one of the author of the H-curve paper that is present in this room. So what the first scenario is constant treatment effect. So if we see the control group and treatment group, they have the same shape and it's just shifted. And the second scenario is linear treatment effect. So this means that the rest is affecting more if you are older. So like the effect of the treatment effect is bigger as you get like older. And finally, the last scenario is like the totally like very complex one, where like the treated group and control group is like looks totally different. And we evaluated like our approaches on those cases. And one thing that I want to know is that like due to the fundamental problem of causal inference, which is that you never observe your counterfactual, right? So let's say like your counterfactual is taking aspirin or not taking aspirin. You only observe the case. If you take the aspirin, you only observe taking the aspirin. Like you wouldn't observe your headache when you didn't take the aspirin. So like this simulation, like these causal effect models can be only evaluated using the simulation because in that case, like you have the counterfactual, like both of the values that could be simulated. So this is a result of the simulation. As we expected, the simplest model, which is the S-learner with OLS, does very well in the simplest scenarios, like simulation, which is like almost the error is almost zero. But as it gets like complicated, which in simulation 2, where the treatment effect was like linear, then T-learner with random forest gets got the lowest MSE, and for the most complex one, actually, the X-learner with random forest got the least MSE. Okay, now based on this scenario, which one should we use for our NBA data? Probably in NBA data is complex enough, as in simulation 3, because it has a lot of confounders such as temperature or like how many hours they travel, whether it is a back-to-back, and there's so many confounders. So maybe like the good like a combination of the learner and base learner would be the X learner with random forest. So we applied this to NBA data to assess the load management. Bit of the background on like load management. The success is that Kawhi Leonard in 2018 and 2019 season, he only played 60 games out of 82, and he was a top 4 playoff and got the championship. There's critique since this season. There's a player participation policy, requires star players to participate more frequently. And our contribution is that we did this quantitatively. There's a note that I'll skip. Okay, so these are the results for the T-learner with like conditional expectation function. It's the first ingredient I was expecting. So for X-learner with random forest that I said that is the best model, we cannot plot both of them because the nature of like crossing. We can only we get only a curve for the treatment effect itself. In T-learner, taking the advantage is that you can actually plot the both of the pattern. For example, and mu1 is a treatment group. So like mu1, the red one is the rested players, and mu0 is the not the back-to-back players. And we can see that net rating is generally significant in bootstrap confidence interval 90%, but mainly it's coming from the defensive end. If you see the effect is way more significant in defensive end rather than offensive end. And this might be because, you know, if you are like higher and you're playing, maybe like you have to play well in offense because you have a lot of attention. But in defense, you can just like relax a little bit. And so like the treatment effect of resting would get higher in the defensive end rather than offensive end. We did this for like both plots, but due to the time, I think I must skip most of it. But like the effect is diluted in net rating, the effect was like stronger. But here, like the only one that are kind of significant are blocks and not scales, which are the box statistics that are more like physically like requiring, right? And then we did analysis for field goal percentage. We see that to the left is the general field goal percentage, and the middle one is 3-point, and this is a true shooting. And we can see that for 3-pointer, like if the effect is less significant than general field goal, like a percentage in the right. And this might be because as you get closer to the rim, like it gets more physical, so like you need more like rest effects more, or when you are like closer to the rim rather than 3-pointer, right? We did the same thing for the X-learner with random forest, as I mentioned, like not as in T-learner where we can plot both of the shapes. We can only plot the treatment effect. we can see the same thing, that the defensive rating is way more significant than the offensive end. So concluding that the rest matters more in defense rather than offense. And this is for the shooting percentage. We could also see that the red one is the 3-point percentage. So if that overlaps with 0, means that the rest is not significant. We could see also that the field goal percentage is more significant than in 3-point shooting. And this is my last slide. So rest matters somewhat, but more in defensive end. And we advanced the curve literature by incorporating rich game level data, devising a framework to incorporate the causality, and we allow to capture non-linear trends using those machine learning techniques. The future work would be to do a multiple treatment so that like we can differentiate between like now we are doing back-to-back and non-back-to-back, but maybe we can differentiate like 1 day of rest versus 2-day rest, or 2-day rest versus 3-day rest. And like we estimate that those effects would be going to be like some kind of log shape. And we can also like apply to fatigue index that Esteban was talking in the morning. Okay, that's it. Thanks so much for the attention.
A few minutes for questions. 1 minute. 2 minutes for questions. Any questions?
Did you have any measures of uncertainty associated with your curve?
Oh, I mean, I have the bootstrap like confidence interval, right?
I missed that, sorry.
Yeah. So there is yeah, those bands are bootstrap confidence interval.
That's what they are.
It's hard to get it like distributionary because the model gets more complex than traditional OLS.
So you copy at 40 NBA players, 2 NBA players.
Oh yeah,
Without 40.
actually there are not many like player in my data set after certain age. So here's the appendix. We can see that at 42, I have like only 10 games, and like mainly non-back-to-back, like player older, like with 42 age, never played a back-to-back game, like according to this plot. So we cut, because in counter inference there is a overlap assumption, so at least you have to have like one observation in certain group. And for 41 and 42, we have the violation of that assumption. So we cut it to, I think we have until 39 years old. And that's a great point that I forgot to mention, is that the confidence span for like older player is way wider because of the small sample size.
Yes. Same thing with mortality towards the end of over 100.
Yeah, it's hard to survive in the NBA. It's hard. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, it's because of it could be because of survival bias, but also because when players are too old, like as we can see in the band, the estimate is not very accurate because you know there's a lot of barrier. So that might be the other thing. But yeah, that's a good point.
More questions? No more, then let's give a round of applause. So Mena Whalen from Loyola University, Chicago. She's going to talk about empirical determination of baseball eras, a multivariate changepoint analysis in Major League Baseball. Let's welcome Dr. Whalen.
Okay, hopefully that works. Start this. Okay, so kind of a fancy title, but all I'm trying to say is that I'm using data to talk about something that people have hopefully discussed and debated for a while, and I'm just like, oh, I did it. And really, I would like also to say that I'm a statistician first and foremost, and I did this work with Greg Matthews, who I'm sure you've seen 100 times at this conference, and we were chatting, and I was like, oh, I know the methodology to answer this question. Like, this is what I do all the time. There we go. So I'll kind of introduce the problem, the methodology, just like a little baby bit, and then really go through a lot of the results because we have a lot of interesting results that I think you guys will think are interesting. So high level, I think this can be used in a ton of applications, and I would like more people to do it, especially in sports. It's so like full of data. So basically, does a sport like Major League Baseball change over time? Like there's changes to how the game is played. All of this is about, we now have data to understand how we can change the game. So how do aspects and measures of the game change over time? And then if they do change, when are they changing? And so what we want is to understand shifts in baseball. And I look at a couple of other things like within a team. And so basically what we're asking here is what are the eras of baseball? And then specifically within a team, or what I will say is a franchise, are there dynasties or collapses of dynasties within a team? But again, okay, so people have hypothesized this. They're like dead ball era, live ball era, eras of things. And so people have hypothesized a lot of these, written about them, and it has been done empirically a couple of times through what I'm going to use, but they're only looking at a single statistic. So like, how do home runs change over time? How do other things change over time? So they did it on slugging, home runs, batting, and RBIs, batting average, and then somebody did it on a single player of Barry Bonds and looking at like, did he have a change due to steroid use in some of his metrics? And then they've also done it for competitive balance. Where was the economist in there? I'm also working on a paper right now about competitive balance stuff for all leagues using the same methodology. And so these were all just done one person, one statistic. But is that an era of baseball? How does the whole game change together? We need to account for more than just home runs, right? We want to think about them all together. So I want to identify and confirm these changes overall in the game, then specifically by those game metrics. And then I also want to look within teams and find these kind of dynasty teams. And I want to do that multivariately. I want to do that together where I'm accounting for all of these things changing together, where I say they have one change based on all of these different things. So Changepoint methodology, I don't think anyone's done that too much. So I wanted to introduce a univariate case. This is a very easy visual change point where you can see it's just kind of bouncing around at this constant flat rate, and then it jumps to up here. And so you're like, this location in time is the change point. This is very easy to see with our eyes, but in real life, it's much more complicated. And how do you empirically determine that? The easiest function to use is the Q-sum statistic, which basically is a weighted average of, if I take a segment here and then I look at the rest of the segment, how big is their difference? And it's like a weighted average. So if I just look really at a small place here, and then the rest of this, I'm not going to say that that's too different from each other. And so this statistic at the bottom is taking along and saying, okay, if I cut it right here, this is the Q-sum statistic. We can see that it maxes out here, where if I took this segment, I'm going to say that it's very different than this segment, okay? So that's a Q-sum, you're kind of working across time. And so what's important to remember for this and the rest of the presentation is A, this is looking in the past, so don't ask me about the future. And B, it depends on how much time we're looking at. So if we're too close to the sides, it's really hard to detect anything. So when you think about 2020, which is the end of my data, I can't tell you anything else because it's too close to the end. So that's Q-sum, basically. And again, this is univariate. So what do I do? Quick method slide. There's something called a double Q-sum that these creators came up with, which basically is doing it multivariately. So I have all these time series, and I have a bunch of Q-sums for all of them across every single time point. And so what they do is they order and kind of rank them, and I'm looking at just the biggest ones, where they're all happening across all the time series. So like certain changes, if they're really present across the whole game of baseball, should come up in lots of sports measures. And so they also use an algorithm. Normally univariately you use binary segmentation, which is like a tree, and it kind of just splits it, and it's like, I found a change point. So look at this half and the second half, and you keep going recursively until you can't find any more. And sparsified binary segmentation is a high dimensional version of the same algorithm. So simple things push to the multivariate case and high dimensionality. Okay. Again. Okay, so got this data from the Llama data set, kind of like late 1800s to 2020 was when it ended. And there was honestly not that much missing data in there, which was pretty impressive. So I just did like simple imputation for that. And then I standardized everything to, it's a year. So I just have the year average of these things for the different teams. And I standardized them to kind of per game rates because different seasons will play different amounts of games. And then specifically, I'm doing these 3 types of different analyses, which I'm going to call league level, metric level, and franchise level. So league level, that's like, does baseball change over time? And so that I look at 4 statistics across 16 teams from 1900 to 2020. So all of them had to exist for this whole period of time. And all 4 of these statistics we deemed crucial to like the league of baseball and like stay consistently important to baseball throughout the whole period of time. Home runs, strikeouts, walks, and stolen bases. So that's the league level. And the panel, the thing of replicated time series, is those metrics. So I'm looking at those 4 statistics together. Then the metric level stats are, I'm basically looking where I'm repeating 16 teams. So those are the repeated things that I'm looking at now. And I'm looking at home runs, strikeouts, walks, stolen bases, runs, and then attendance. So now I'm just looking at these different metrics to see how they change in time, kind of by themselves, but across these teams that have existed for this whole period of time. And then the last one, which I think is the coolest and what everyone is probably going to ask questions about, because they'll be like, there's my team. Let me ask questions about that. The 32 modern franchise teams, we basically look at within the team, kind of a offense versus defense kind of combination of metrics, runs, home runs, hits, walks, strikeouts, and then basically the against version. So if you have like kind of an average team, they should plateau around 0. But if you're like a really good team compared to the rest of the whole league, you should be a positive kind of team. Otherwise, you'll be a negative credit team. Looking at all of those. So those are kind of how the data is structured, which is why I'm going to go through a lot of results. But so again, league level is like, does baseball change? Metric specific is like, how do these statistics change over time? And then franchise level is like, are there dynasties? Like, are you a really good team or a really bad team? Okay, so league level analysis. So there are 4 change points here, and actually, secret, I also looked at variance change points because I only described how to talk about a mean, but there's also variability, which you can kind of see visually with your eyes. This is like early baseball. They are all over the place across walks, home runs, stolen bases, strikeouts. Huge variability here, and then a variance change point, and then closely after a mean change point. And so you can kind of think of like, this is an era, this is an era, this is an era, and so on. Okay, so let me put those into words. The variance era, the very first one, is probably the beginning of the live ball era. And then in 24, that's the end of the dead ball era going into more live ball era. 54 is basically changes in philosophy of the game and how they umpire and how you manage. I can talk more about that specifically. And then 1993 is a lot of expansion time of the 90s. Also something in the 90s. And then basically 2009, there's changes in the strike zone, reductions of walks, and honestly, I would kind of call this the more data-driven one. Like now that we have more understanding, well, how are we changing the game differently to adapt to what will score us runs or make us win the game. So this is overall baseball changes. And these are really good results because the people who have done this with one statistic, this matches up with what we saw before. So this is a little bit done before, but it's good that we're getting similar results to what people have talked about and what has been done before, but we did it looking at all of these statistics together. So this one is the metric specific. And so every single team, the 16 teams are kind of printed in gray, and then I just highlighted the average with variability on top. And so you can kind of see that attendance has been growing. Like, I really feel like this to here is where it became like American pastime in terms of attendance. And if you can look, like this is right about the end of the war, really became very popular and has been growing ever since. And then actually this obviously dropped off because of COVID. And I'm really curious to actually see what happens in terms of attendance. They've been changing like stadium sizes, and like you can't fill it up the way that you used to before. The other interesting one is obviously home runs. And I think this one is the most volatile. It has the most mean and variance changes. So when you look at these, just kind of think about like I drew a flat line across them, how they're kind of going up or down, or a lot of variability in all of them. So I can talk more about that in a second. But like walks and runs changing about the same period of time changed the game of like how you're pitching, how you're trying to get people on base, things like that. Similar time period with strikeouts and stolen bases. Oh, I'm doing good on time. Okay. So a lot of the home runs, so live ball era, post-war stuff, changes to the mound, changes to steroid use or non-steroid use. And then this kind of more recent change about how we are hitting home runs differently than we had in the past, using probably more data. Runs, kind of end of the dead ball, 1940s integration era, bringing more people in, stolen bases, strikeouts. A lot of things have to deal basically with how the game is being played. So back to those kind of eras of baseball overall are still fitting into these individual measures of the statistics. Okay, then this one is the best graphic I think I've ever made. So for each of these, there's 10 statistics going on within a single team. And I couldn't show you every single change point and every single thing on it. That's 32 times 10. That's too much stuff to look at. So what this is basically the gray bands are the existence of the team. So if it's really short, that's really hard to detect change points because you have to determine where those breaks are happening. And if it's really long, you can see they've been around for a long time. And then a circle is a change in the mean. And a diamond is, or a triangle is a change in the variance. And then I use breaks like team colors package. So they all match the colors of the team and blah, blah, blah. Looks very fancy. It took a lot of work, but I really like this visual because you can kind of see, especially up and down, where like teams get added in, how there's change points right around the same time because you're adding more players in, you're adding more teams, and so it's going to create this kind of like pressure change of like, now we have dynasties and now we have collapses because there's just more there to play with. And so since here, Boston Red Sox, there's a couple change points, even more recent one, change in variability. That one's a bad one though. So some highlights to pull out. Okay, I'm doing. So like in the 90s, 1990, the Braves had a change point where they had a lot of early success in like lots of World Series. And then really they believed that that was due to really good pitching. Cleveland Guardians, 1993. Really good hitting team, but fell short of winning the World Series during their peak. But they still kind of had like a dynasty shift there. So they had a bunch of changes in all their metrics. The Rays, transition from years of poor performance because they're an expansion team. So they had some of the lower players, they had a lot of variability. And then they moved into being really good, really fast, and won World Series. And so this was kind of like the birth of a dynasty here. And then same thing with the Nationals. And again, these are franchises. So when they move, that's one franchise in this data set, okay? But they basically were terrible and then got really good all of a sudden after their relocation. And that sparked a kind of dynasty change for them in a positive way. So overall, we found a lot of the traditional eras that people hypothesized about. Dead ball, integration, steroid, post-steroid, even some more modern eras of like using data analytics and like changing the way the game is played a little bit. And then classified some kind of dynasties for teams. And I didn't really talk about the declines because that seems like a bummer, so I tried to talk about the good ones. And then basically, I think this could be used all the time. I'm already writing another paper right now with competitive balance measures to see like when more competition leads to more changes in the game. But there's tons of uses to do this to other sports. The only drawback is you just need a lot of time data. So we looked at it every year, so we needed, 120 years is a pretty good place to start. But other things, like I tried to look at women's sports, but there wasn't enough data. But if I looked at it per game and I had a much granular level of game over time, you could also look at that as well. So right for determining eras in the past and kind of saying what was coming out of there. So thank you. If you have any questions. Emily? Yeah.
Thank you. That was awesome. Okay, thinking about the talks recently about like some of the women's college basketball and like the change in like some of them entering kind of the NBA. Did you find any change points that maybe like corresponded with timing of like generational talent and things like that like enter the league?
Yeah, I think this is too high level because it's like, especially for the team stuff, it's about team performance where we kind of put like a positive and a negative. So even if you're really good for like 1 or 2 years and that person like plays for the same team forever, maybe that might create a dynasty, but it has to be everyone coming together. So I think you could take the same idea. I also thought about this within like really good players and like looking at their change points, just like they did with Barry Bonstead and Texas steroid use, to be like, when were they in their like heyday of doing stuff? And I had a student actually propose when I presented this to him first. He's a senior about to graduate in our data science program. And I was like, what do you think? What questions do you have? And he was like, oh, I want to look at almost like hot hands kind of stuff in basketball. I was like, ooh, that would be really interesting. But yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. Yeah.
Like during these like change points, there's a lot of things that could have happened to the team. Like for example, it doesn't say that the team will move, but sometimes like it's like so clear what happened. So how do you determine like how are you determining what cause?
Yes, so none of this is causal. That's a really, really good question. So this is why I was a statistician, is I was like, I can do all the math and I made all these pretty graphics for you. And I was like, now you have to go figure out what was happening at this time period. So I worked with Greg and Brian Mills, who's at Texas. They know baseball a lot better than I did. And so we just hypothesized what was changing around those times. We're just saying, this is when the data is telling us that it's changing. But they were always really close to like changes in the pitcher mount, changes to like rules of how they like did strikeouts or things like that. So they were always closely aligned. And it's interesting to look at, I look at Changepoint for a lot of different things, but it's kind of like if I implemented a policy, it might not impact right away when I implement it. It might impact 2 years later. Or if people are like thinking that the change will come, they might change their strategy before, and I can actually see a change before it happens. So that's kind of why we look at it like empirically through the data and not say it's exactly this or it's exactly this. It's kind of here's what the data is saying, and so we think it's these things. But that's a really good question. There's no causal inference of change point analysis. Yeah.
So I like to talk a lot like the way it's pictured. A small suggestion would be at the league level, have the same plot with the different commissioners underneath it. So
Ooh.
like.
Yeah,
you
we
see a
tried to
plot-
look at it for who owned the team as well,
Yeah.
because a lot of, there's so much with the 32 teams, because both of them had their own teams and they really looked into those and like determined those. And that was something that we came up with, who owned the team and then commissioners as well. That's a really good point. I like that one as well, because I think something in like I can't remember, but they talked about this as well, like the goals of the high level.
Yeah, like just selfishly as a Yankee fan, I saw like in the 70s, I think that's when Steinbrenner bought the team, and it's a Changepoint.
Yes.
And it's
Yes.
just like an economics graph slide, you'll see like Republican Party tax rates go down,
Yeah,
Democrats tax rates go up, and then, so it'd just be interesting to see that.
that's very true. I'm pretty sure that's written in the paper. That's why I remember this. Is exactly that. So I just pulled out a couple of highlights, but in the paper we tried to talk about as many of the teams as possible.
One last question?
So I had a quick question. When you were showing your plots of each of the different statistics, one of the over here, this one here. When you were looking at attendance, were you counting for population? At the time?
No, and that was the thing, is that when we looked at some of these, like some of them were really high, and I was like, that's crazy. Why are they so high? Is that we don't know like per stadium, like what's the per stadium size? And they like with the ones in New York, I think they just changed the stadium recently to cap it. So there's no like anything like that, especially because teams also change locations over time. So this was just kind of like raw attendance, but any kind of appropriation would be pretty good. We did standardize it by how many games were played. Like, what does that even kind of mean? It's kind of just like a per game attendance.
Next thing, Dr. Whalen. So our last speaker is Dr. Dale Zimmerman from the University of Iowa. He's going to talk about parametric outline fitting to track the evolution of the called strike zone in the Major League Baseball from 2008 to 2023. Let's give a warm round of applause for Dr. Zimmerman.
Okay, so my talk's got some overtones similar to the previous talk, in that I'm trying to explore what's happening over time. I'm not looking for specific change points though. And I'm focused only on one object, the called strike zone, as opposed to lots of different things in baseball. At the risk of telling you something you already know on these first couple slides, here's a formal definition of the strike zone from the official rules of baseball. I'm not going to read it. So I'm going to show you a picture in just a second. And then this is another part of it. Strike is a legal pitch when so called by the umpire, which if not struck at, if any part of the ball passes through any part of the strike zone. And so here's a picture. Okay, so it's rectangular in shape. And that's kind of our reference point for some of the called strike zones I'll be showing you. Now, I'm sure this comes as a great surprise to all of you that umpires make mistakes on called pitches and may even adhere to a strike zone somewhat different than what the rule book specifies it should be. And we call this alternative strike zone the called strike zone. That's sort of a term that's been accepted now. And it's defined loosely for now, I'll say, as the largest smooth outline region containing those points in which a called pitch is more likely to be called a strike than a ball. I'll tell you how we actually formally determine it in a later slide. But I want to point out that it's a fluid object. It varies across time. That's what I'm going to focus on today. It varies across pitchers. Pitchers have different strike zones, called strike zones, batters, umpires. That's a really interesting phenomenon. You can study the called strike zones of specific umpires. You know, some call the outside on the left side of the plate pitch a strike more often than others. And so it's interesting to compare different umpires. Game situations affect the called strike zone greatly. When the count is full, or when it's a 3-0 count, the strike zone expands drastically from what it is when at other counts. Our focus today will be on changes in the called strike zone over time. And so here's a graphic that shows you, read left to right down the page, just like you would reading a book, to see the timeline. And you can see that in 2008, when data were first collected of this time, or data were first widely available of this phenomenon, the strike zone, called strike zone, was a rather squat object. It was wide, not so tall. As time went on, it got taller and less wide. And in recent years, up to 2022, it's now, visually at least, in fairly good conformance with the rulebook strike zone. I've put boxes up there for reference. The the vertical lines are well defined by the rulebook strike zone definition. The upper and lower lines are determined by the batter, and so those aren't fixed for each batter, but these are shown, the ones that are shown are averaged overall batters that came to bat in that, well, that had called strikes on, had strikes called on them in that year. So it appears that the called strike zone got taller and narrower over time, but how can we attach some measures of statistical significance to that? And is the called strike zone becoming measurably more like the rulebook strike zone? Visually, it certainly seems to be. So we developed methodology for addressing these questions using the available data. Over the 9-year period from 2008 to 2016, the system that collected the data was called the PitchFX system. And then it was switched over to the TrackMan system from 2017 to 2022. Basically, it changed from cameras to radar, Doppler radar, but and the locations of the cameras is different than the location of the radar, but it's all accepted and it's part of the official Major League Baseball data that's available to anybody that wants it now. Over the period we consider, this 15-year period, there were roughly 5 million called pitches, corresponding to several thousand pitchers and batters and about 200 home plate umpires. Of those nearly 5 million called pitches, a little over 2/3 were called balls and the rest were called strikes. And that ratio, that breakdown has been very consistent over years. Of the called balls, about 5% were incorrectly called. They were inside the rule book strike zone. Of the called strikes, more than 22% were outside the rule book strike zone. So that the misclassifications are more with the pitches that should have been called balls that are called strikes. And overall, umpires misclassified about 10% of the called pitches over this 15-year period, but it's not been constant over time. Their accuracy has improved quite a bit and very steadily. No major change point there. It's a very consistent evolution, both in the misclassified balls and the misclassified strikes. They're both going down. Even just last year, well, the last year of the shown here, which is 2022, there was a very large drop in the proportion of pitches that were called incorrectly as strikes. So when this will end, nobody knows, but it's ongoing, hasn't stopped yet. Now, accuracy isn't everything, right? Fans and managers will tolerate some lack of accuracy as long as the umpire is consistent in what they call. So not too long ago, people started looking at this data with respect to within-game consistency. And one measure of within-game consistencies shown here that basically you're subtracting from one the ratio of the number of balls within the convex hull of called strikes over the total number of called balls. So it focuses on the called balls, and if any are inside the umpire's strike zone for that game, as determined by the convex hull, that's regarded as an inconsistent pitch. So here's just an example from one game broken down by right-handers and left-handers. And the right-handers, there were no inconsistencies called by the umpire in that game. But on the left-handers, there was one ball that was inside the convex hull. So how is this consistency measured trending over time? Well, just like accuracy, it's been improving a lot too, improving steadily. So these are all good things, right? There's been some clamor for the baseball to get rid of umpires and make it an automated system and everything. They could argue, Major League Baseball could argue, well, things are improving, so your arguments don't have as much import, perhaps. Well, let me show these outlines again. I want to tell you where they're coming from and what we're going to do with them, because I'm not quite satisfied just with an overall accuracy and overall consistency trend. I want to see what's happening actually to the strike zone, to its geometry at a finer scale. So what these outlines are outlines that are determined by applying a discriminant analysis procedure, basically kernel density based, on the horizontal and vertical coordinates of all called pitches in that year. And the outline determines where a pitch is more likely to be called a strike than a ball. That's the shaded region, and the outside regions where it's more likely to be called a ball than a strike. And as you saw, the called strike zone was not centered on the rulebook strike zone. It's historically been shifted slightly left, although it's, as I'll argue in a minute, we're actually about spot on now in terms of its horizontal shift. It was considerably wider at its widest point than the rulebook strike zone. That's still slightly true, but not as much, as we'll see. And the shape is not rectangular. The edges are curved, so it's not conforming to the rulebook strike zone shape, which is supposed to be a rectangle. Furthermore, the upper margin, the upper part of the outline, the upper half of the outline is more rounded than the bottom half. You can convince yourself of that if you tilt your head upside down, and then it really pops out at you that the bottom half is more straight across there than the upper half is. So what's the shape of this region? Well, it's not rectangular, it's somewhat elliptical, but because it has this more rounded corners, it falls into the family of what are called superellipses. More rounded than a rectangle, but less rounded than an ellipse, actually. It falls into the family of what are called superellipses. And some years ago, when I was a graduate student working at Iowa State in their ag experiment station, I had done some work with some biologists. They do this stuff called morphometric analysis, where they're trying to study the shapes of objects, like the shapes of skulls of animals or the wings of insects or something like that. And then they try to, classify or figure out the evolution of these animals over time using these shapes and things within genera to compare the shapes. So it occurred to me I could borrow some of those ideas to study the outline of the called strike zone. What you have to do is digitize the outline and then somehow quantify the geometric information in the outline. And once you quantify that geometric information, then I'm going to plot that versus year and then carry out a simple non-parametric test for time trend to see if there's been a significant change in those geometric attributes over time. Specifically, the model that I fit was a super elliptic model, or a more generalized version there's many different models that have been proposed. Some are non-parametric. The elliptic Fourier models are sometimes used. But this particular generalized super elliptic model called the ATLAS, that's an acronym for, hold on for it, asymmetrically transformed, affine transformed, latitudinally asymmetric superellipse. By saying that real fast 3 times. Affine transformed means it allows some skew. It doesn't have to be, oriented straight up and down. It can have some skew to it. Latitudinally asymmetric means the top half can be more rounded than the bottom half. And then it's a superellipse. So here's a basic equation of a superellipse. If put in r equals 1 there, and you would have the equation of an ellipse, right? With x naught and y naught being the center of the ellipse, and a being the width, and b being the height. Or half width and half height, actually. But so that'd be an ellipse. But that r is a parameter that controls how rectangular the object is. It's a rectangularity index. And so you can get objects that range from the top, look at the top line here, an ellipse to a rectangle, depending on the magnitude of that r. And the strike zone is more kind of like something in the middle two there, but also it had a little bit of skew to it. So we need to take care of that. And it had a more rounded top, like the things on the right-hand bottom there, more rounded top than the bottom edge. Okay, so that's what we need this ATLAS model for. Adds a couple more parameters, but it's more flexible to fit what visually the called strike zone looks like. So this model has a shear parameter S that allows for that slant. And then it has 2 distinct rectangularity indexes, one for the top half, one for the bottom half. And that model just fits great. It really, it's almost impossible to see any discrepancy between some of the called strike zone pictures there and the best fitting generalized superellipse, this ATLAS model. And all of these parameters are readily interpretable. That's the beauty of this model as opposed to some of the others that have been proposed. Okay, so this plot, I need to explain it a little bit. It shows the time trend of each of the parameters. So starting in the upper left, that's the horizontal center of the called strike zone. And you see that except for a kind of a glitch in 2009, there's been a steady trend towards the middle of the strike zone. So that's been improving over time. The vertical center is next to that in the top row, the middle one in the top row. And that's been steadily improving, although maybe leveling off. These plots only go up to 2016, not up to 2022. And then the A is the half width of the superellipse, and that's steadily been decreasing over time to where it's actually gotten a little bit narrower than the rulebook strike zone. Rulebook strike zone's width is 1.00 there. We surpassed it a little bit. The first one in the middle row is the vertical half width. That's been increasing. And it's shot past what the vertical height of the average rulebook strike zone is. I think I'll go down to the bottom row. The R1 and the R2 there, those are the rectangularity indexes. Those have both been increasing over time, which means the corners, the 4 corners of the called strike zone have been, well, 4 corners of the rulebook strike zone have been filling in with the called strike zone. The called strike zone's been becoming more rectangular and filling in those empty spots in the corners that used to be there. So that's a great thing. The shear parameter on the bottom right hasn't changed much. So all parameters except height, area, and shear have gotten closer to the values for the rulebook strike zone. These are just plots again. I haven't produced analogous plots and trends for the last 6 years here. I had hoped to by this meeting, but I didn't get it done. But I'm sure what I'm going to see is the shift of the called strike zone to the right is continued to the point where it's almost centered on the center of the plate now. And if you look at 2022, there's no tilt to that at all. The shear is gone, and I'm sure I'll see that. But one thing that's interesting is that the high strike is being called more now. And so there's a little bit of an extension above the rulebook strike zone that didn't used to be there. So conclusions. Statistical analyses confirm what baseball fans have said for a long time. The called strike zone and the rulebook strike zone differ significantly. Called strike zone is not rectangular and has changed significantly over time. The Atlas model fits it very well. And the nice thing about that model is that its geometric features are readily interpretable. So we can say specifically that the width has changed or not, or the shear has changed or not, or the rectangularity has changed or not. Those sorts of aspects I think are interesting to comment on about the called strike zone. The height and area of the strike zone have increased a little bit over time. Those are the things that have. And runs scored per game are strongly negatively correlated with the area of the called strike zone. Excuse me. So over that period from 2008 to 2016, where the area was really increasing, runs per game did go down. Now, that's just an association. I can't prove that's causative, you know, but it's not something that should surprise us. And improvements in umpire performance since 2008 have been remarkable, if you ask me. I think the institution of this feedback system to the umpires has really been helpful in improving their performance. At some point, though, it's got to level off, right? I mean, there's an upper bound on how accurate they could be. So, 100% accuracy. So at some point, it's got to level off. And I'm just curious to know whether that'll happen in my lifetime or not. So we'll see. If you want to see the kind of the results up to 2016, that first paper there has more details on this. And then we're writing a paper with the more recent results as soon as we get them as the second paper here. So thank you for your attention.
Questions for Dr. Zimmerman?
Yeah.
This might be a dumb question, but how much of the rounding is due to the fact the ball is round?
Yeah, so the question was how much of the rounding is due to the fact that the outline is round itself? I don't know. I mean, a ball is called a strike if any part of the ball touches the, it's supposed to be called a strike if any part of the ball touches the rule book strike zone. I don't know if that addresses your question or not.
Well, like, so in the bottom of the strike zone,
Yeah.
rounded.
Yeah.
What's that edge? Is it like the center of the ball, or is it top?
No, it's the edge of the ball. It's any part of the ball touching the.
Okay, so that bottom left rounded part, that's the very top right of the baseball.
Correct.
Got it. Okay. Right.
Your guess is as good as mine. I don't know if the shape of the ball actually makes that difference. I think more what makes the edges rounded is the tendency. I think people have done some psychological tests on this. People tend to smooth things over when they make calls of things, not just on strikes, but they tend to report objects as being more rounded than they actually were.
Formula-wise, it doesn't have any effect on
The what?
formula. Is just the very edge point. So those are points.
Yeah.
I don't know much about baseball, but my question is to do with the math. So you estimated the parameters R1, R2, yes. How did you do that? So you observe X, Y,
Right.
for each year,
Okay.
but you have to have a loss function. Right?
Yeah. So I glossed over that. These squares is how we did it. There are available algorithms out there for fitting outlines to curves by minimizing the sum of square deviations from the normals to those curves.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So just by these, I think.
Good question.
Yeah, so the observed minus whatever the function is squared. Right? That would happen to be, yeah. That is-
I think my question was similar to his, is like, should it naturally be more rounded? Because when you think about like noise, like a lot of the Changepoint stuff I do is about what detecting noises. And when you look at noise, especially like in a spatial sense, it's more circular. Like just randomness should come more circularly if like you're trying to hit it right at the middle. So like I can like, should they even have those little corners? Like in the strike zone, like should they, do you think like they should just actually make it more circular?
Do I think the powers that be in baseball to change the shape of the rule book
Maybe,
strike zone?
like if
No,
those
I don't.
corners
I'm
don't have.
conservative in that aspect. I don't want baseball to change.
Yeah. Well, it's just like, do those corners even matter? Cause like naturally, maybe this is a mathematical physics question. Cause like, what does it mean to go, like if you're trying to shoot for the dead middle, that corner seems unnatural. Right?
Unless you're trying to aim for the corner,
Uh,
because it's the hardest spot to hit.
Still time to take questions, okay?
Like possible for the ball, like the very, very corner of the strike zone, isn't it impossible for the ball to touch the corner of the strike zone without ball?
Without doing what?
If you have the strike zone,
Yeah.
it's like, if it's like this, like it's impossible for the ball to like actually touch the corner of the strike zone. Like stop the corner,
No, it touched the exact corner of the strike zone.
but then the end of the ball would be out.
You got a rectangle, you just put the ball right. You know, it's tangent
But yeah, right.
to the corner. Not, just so it touches the corner. Yeah, it wouldn't be tangent.
One last.
Yeah, you mentioned the differences between umpires. Did you look at any umpire transformation over time, like specific to individual umpires?
No, we didn't look at specific umpire transformations over time. That would be fun to do, yeah. See, you know, if individual umpires, especially those that were older, had been in the league longer, were less, they were more stubborn and less willing to make these changes over time. Yeah.
Or if any have even gotten worse?
We've studied whether that's the case with respect to overall accuracy, but not on these individual geometric attributes. And they are more stubborn. Yeah. The more experienced umpires actually were less, the less performing ones as time went on.
And that's the Dr. Zimmerman.